sleepy beans. If you enjoy my spooky whispers, please give the like button and subscribe button a huge warm hug and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our future uploads. Alright, sleepy beans, let's get into today's story. I don't know what changed. Kim was normal when we met, when we got together. She was for months, a whole year. And now... Hold on, I need a quick shower. I watched as she stepped into the bathroom of our apartment, the shower turning on for the third time that day. She was in when I woke up. She had another after lunch, and here we are again before we go to dinner. And despite that, I swear the whole place smells like roadkill. I don't stop her though, even when her constant showers don't seem to be helping whatever the smell is. I've looked all over the apartment. I've showered extra, but nothing seems to be the source. Is it the bed? I wandered back into our room, thinking about it while I waited for Kim to be ready. Our sheets were clean. I washed them pretty often anyway. They weren't stained. Kim hadn't said anything about the bed, let alone the smell to begin with, even denying it when I brought it up. I considered that I might just be going insane until I spotted something in the sheets. A worm. It looked like there was a worm sticking out of Kim's pillowcase. My brow furrowed as I lifted up the pillow to check it, watching it fall out and hit the bed. My face contorted in disgust. It was dirty, as I guess worms always are. I grabbed a tissue and picked it up, going and loosely tossing it out the window, since I wasn't sure what to do with it. Go decompose something that actually decomposes. The shower turned off down the hall, so I tried to brush the thought off and went to meet her. Kim stepped back out of the bathroom after another few minutes, grabbing a scarf and wrapping it around her neck, giving me a chuckle. It's only in the 60s, you really that cold? Kim gave me a bemused sort of look. Sorry, we can't all be little snowbirds. Come on, we've got a reservation. You can't pull the Californian card when it's barely below room temperature outside. I nudged her playfully as we left the apartment, heading downstairs and out to my car. It almost felt like my elbow went into hers, sinking into her skin ever so slightly, but I wouldn't be able to tell that under her sleeve. Too bad, pulling the Californian card. She hopped into the passenger's seat, subtly massaging where I'd elbowed her. Again, still, I brushed it all off, thinking I was imagining things and blowing them out of proportion. A molehill is only a mountain if I'm looking at it from an ant's point of view. Speaking of ants, I had to fight between the prospect that the restaurant we frequented suddenly had an ant problem, or that the ants were following Kim. They stayed away from my side of our table, but they crawled all over hers, across her hands and through her food, burrowing into it and her very paws before me. She got up constantly for the bathroom. Something about how her new diet was messing with her bladder. But I noticed what it really was. I could see the ants. I could see them swarming her at every step. They floated drowned in her glass of water. Her hands came back more scrubbed raw every time. They were red and almost shrunken looking, wrinkled at the ends, her manicured nails longer than I swore they were yesterday. When Kim stepped away for the 8th or so time, I leaned over across the table to investigate her pasta. She'd been eating hungrily the whole time, so not very much was left. Still, ants pulled all over the plate, the surviving ones devouring its remains. My face scrunched up with disgust. She was quick to return though, so I played it off and hoped she didn't notice. Kim moved over the table to kiss me when we stood to leave. Her breath felt like it had been festering for months, vile, chilly, even underneath the scent of pasta. She tasted like spoiled meat and Alfredo sauce. I think she noticed the way I recoiled at it, no matter how much I tried to cover it up. She gave me another little look. What? I didn't think the pasta smelled that bad. I forced a smile, just stronger than I expected. Kim shrugged, taking my hand to lead me back out to our car once I tipped. I pursed my lips as I looked at the back of her blonde head, and I felt something in my mouth. With my free hand, I reached up, opening my mouth and pulling it out. Something hard and jagged. Half of a tooth. I felt sick. My tongue ran over my own teeth, just to be sure I hadn't bit one out without noticing. But no, there was nothing. Nothing hurt in my mouth, except where the shard had poked my cheek. There was no way it was mine. I looked back up at Kim as we reached the car, flicking the broken tooth away as my stomach churned, trying to ignore the growing suspicions that something was wrong with her. She turned and smiled at me, all the same, hopping in the passenger seat and strapping in. Maybe I was just going insane. I went back to writing it off for the rest of the night, like an idiot. She didn't want to kiss me goodnight, probably after earlier. Not that I really wanted to taste that again anyway. Things were only getting worse though. I woke up hearing the shower running. I flipped over, checking the time, thinking my alarm was about to go off, but it was 4 a.m. I could hear Kim fumbling around in the bathroom. Turning back to her side of the bed, I glanced over the sheet and pillow. It was hard to tell in the dark, but I swore it looked grimy. Still, I closed my eyes again, lulling myself off with the bitter pattering of the shower. At least, I tried to, eventually having to scoop myself away from her side because of the smell. Still, it wasn't enough to knock me out before she came back, wrapping her arms around me from behind and resting her forehead against my shoulder. Rancid, cold breath sent a shiver down my spine, but I just kept trying to get to sleep through it. It was only getting harder to do that, though. She was cold, unnatural. The smell was growing unbearable. Worse than any of that, I could feel something wriggling its way underneath me. Countless little maggots worming against my skin, writhing, nibbling, eating away at me, slowly, all with such deliberate bites you would think they held personal grudges. But I was scared, terrified really, that if I were to move, I'd make it real. It wouldn't be a dream if I addressed it, so I just had to pretend it wasn't there. 3 agonizing hours went by before it slowed to a stop, the parasites retreating to where they came from, just in time for my alarm to go off. Finally able to get up, I left Kim whining about the cold and went straight for the bathroom. My skin was reddened, my lower back itched, clearly covered in little flecks of gnawing when I could get a good look. I exhaled a shaky breath, getting into the shower and scrubbing it up with soap and lotion, shutting my eyes and praying it would go away if I kept ignoring it. It must be something more explainable. What the fuck kind of answer was there for this? I let Kim into the bathroom so I could get dressed. The shower turned on again, of course, and I could hear her practically chucking mouthwash beyond the door, feeling as if that might taste even worse than what it felt like last night. I got ready for work quickly and left breakfast on the table for her before I headed out. It wouldn't stop itching. I had to hold it together. It was utterly unbearable. I'm still surprised no one called me out on how many times I went to the bathroom that day just to itch and reapply what little lotion I had left. Scrubbing my own hands red, staring down at them, making sure they didn't look shrunken. They were fine. It was stupid to be checking. Disgust crawled across me all day. I was swatting at more flies than I could count through every hour. So, I scrubbed more, tabbed on some cologne. They swarmed me regardless. I was running out of reasons to deny that something was up. On the drive home, I considered my options, how I could possibly approach the question. I had to. The other choice was starting to look like letting myself be eaten alive by insects. I loved Kim, but I don't think enough to be devoured by bugs until I was a skeleton. When I got home, I had my points in mind, gearing myself up to talk to her. Opening the door met me with that same repulsive scent, but it was mixed with something far nicer. Steak. There you are. Kim jumped me at the door, grabbing me by the collar to loosen my tie. I made dinner. Go get into something comfy so we can eat. I have a surprise for you. So, like a fucking moron, I put it off. I change, I sit, and I have a wonderful meal with my girlfriend. At least the steak is good. The bugs festering in our apartment haven't demolished her cooking skills. Still, the fact that was a possibility that entered my head meant I needed to focus. Kim. Yeah. She looked up from the sink, cleaning up the dishes from dinner. I wanted to ask you something, I haven't been sure how to, I admitted, glancing away from her and off toward our room. Even without looking her way, I could hear how her whole face lit up in her voice. Oh, I have been too. Actually, give me a second. I opened my mouth to cut her off, but she was already running off to our room with soap still on her hands, slamming the door shut in her wake. Okay, I'm holding off again. I sat and waited, hearing the door lock click open after a few seconds. Kim didn't come out. Why don't you come in? She called out, a tone I recognised. I got up, steeling myself. If it was supposed to be a distraction, I couldn't let myself fall for it, no matter how alluring she tried to sound. Step, step, step. I opened the door. Kim was laying back on the bed, wearing a lacy black nightgown. Her feet dangled off of the end, letting my eyes trail up her legs to the hem of the short dress. I snapped my eyes away, back to her face. Of course there was that look. I tried not to let it get to me. I really, really need to talk to you about this, Kim. We have all the time in the world, she replied softly, sitting up and reaching out to pull me over by my shirt. I stumbled slightly, starting to feel almost dazed, blindsided. She wouldn't touch my skin. She knew her flesh was cold and thin. I could see it on her. Her face looked sunken in the dim light of the bedroom. Something crawled out of her tear duct. An ant. My eyes widened, but if she noticed, she couldn't care less. Kim yanked me down onto the bed, forcing me to loom over top of her, hands down on either side of her neatly crossed legs. She unfolded them and leaned back again, staring at me expectantly and nudging my thigh with her toe. I felt so ill. My hand almost moved on its own, resting on her side, slinking down to lift her nightgown, but as it did, I froze up, horrified at what I should have been expecting since I got home. Insects squirm in and out of her stomach, of everything below. Maggots worm in and out, spilling down her body, feasting. I gagged on the smell, that revolting stench of rot, staring in disbelief at the fungus growing out of her rotting meat. She lifts a thinning hand, placing it on my cheek, another maggot wiggling its way out from beneath her fingernail. I felt like I couldn't move. Only shaking breaths kept me alive. How it felt my heart had stopped with the rest of me. Fruit flies buzzed around her naked flesh, gorging in pure delight of the meal she so blessed them with. With her other hand she took my own, moving it towards the festering mess. It's okay, she cooed. I should warn that they bite, but that pain doesn't last. It feels wonderful, I promise. I tried to open my mouth, but my body wouldn't let me. Kim's hand cradled my face as she spoke, continuing to guide my hand through the infestation that her body had become. They like how you taste. Do you want to deprive them of that? Deprive me of it? I could barely get my lips to part. Darling, yes, she insisted, thumb grazing them, but I still couldn't find a word to say. Kim just smiled at me, bringing my hand lower. That's okay. I promise. It'll all be worth it. What we take from nature, we ought to give back, don't you think? When my skin made contact with a spider crawling out from inside of her, my body finally allowed me to react. I wrenched myself away, gasping for clean air, covering my mouth with my clean hand for a moment before I made a run for it. I heard her call out, trying to scramble after me, but I didn't look back. I ran out the door with all I had, barely taking the seconds to grab my keys and wallet, hurrying out to my car. When I made it out there, she was right on my heels, one of my coats hastily draped around her to hide what was oozing from her flesh. I fumbled with my keys and got into my car just as she reached out to grab the door frame to stop me. Her hand was in the way. I slammed it shut. She barely even flinched when the door sliced her fingers in half. I shivered as I looked down at the severed ends, but she was starting to climb onto the hood of the car. I didn't have the time to be repulsed. I started the car and floored it out of the complex, letting her roll off the front when I lurched backwards. I managed to find a motel for the night and I turned my location off, but I'm worried she has another way to find me, or worse, that the infestation has already begun within me. Flies buzz around my head even after my fourth shower of the night. My skin itches. My hand feels almost completely unusable. That smell has followed me here. I can tell. I'm terrified to go to the doctor, but I guess that's my next order of business. But I'm going to make this public first for fear Kim finds me before I can be admitted somewhere. It's too impossible to endure. I don't know how long she's been like this. Maybe I've been being eaten for weeks. Maybe I'm already going to rot. Hello, my sweet little sleepy beans. Today's story is a shorter one because I'm currently battling a cold. But I had to get a video out to you cuties, so if you enjoy my spooky whispers, please give the like button and subscribe button a huge warm hug and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our future uploads. Alright, sleepy beans, let's get into today's story. The sound of police sirens wailed loudly inside the room, but he didn't move. To be honest, I'm not even sure he blinked. He just sat there as he had the entire room in his chair, surrounded by stacks of books, each collecting a thin layer of dust that had made its home on them. So, is there anything else I need to know? I asked curiously, staring at the man sitting in the chair. His eyes were droopy, almost as if he were asleep. His chair was wiry and uncombed, pointed in the air, and his almost white beard had little specks of drool. It was as if he were in a different world as I stood there in his little red and black checkered robe. No, he just sort of sits here all day watching police procedure shows, Bailey responded, parting her bangs with her hand. Her green eyes darted back over to him as he still sat there staring through the TV. I could tell she was ready to get out of her green scrubs and pass over her responsibilities to me. Let me show you where to sleep. He sure does have a lot of books, I added as we walked out the room, entering a hallway with dark blue walls, dark coloured floors leading to a row of open doors. Each room was similar to the one the man was in, organised chaos, books on shelves, stacked on tables, the floors, and any other object that was available. Yeah, he was some sort of scholar. I think an archaeologist or something like that, Bailey replied, as we entered a room that had lime green walls, a queen-size bed nicely made with dark grey sheets and a slightly darker comforter, a relatively modern metal and wood nightstand sitting next to it, a small lamp resting on top of it. This is you. Should I try to pick up and straighten up the place? Bailey laughed. No, we're nurses, not maids. His son can pay for a cleaning service to deal with it. Gotcha, I said, as I laid my backpack on the bed and retrieved my phone charger, plugging it into the wall. So, you said you already fed him his dinner, right? Bailey nodded. Yep, all you have to do is put him to bed, and to be honest, sometimes if he falls asleep in the chair, I just leave him. He seems to just like being there with his shows. What does he usually do for breakfast? I usually just cut up fruit with some yogurt. Seems easy enough. Yeah, I would just relax, catch up on reading or sleep, Bailey said, pulling out her phone and looking at the time. So, do you think you need anything else? I don't think so, I answered, as Bailey headed back to the hallway. Her nose pointed to her phone as she texted furiously, and we walked towards the front door, passing the room with the man. Guns were firing on the television. It's an easy gig, Bailey remarked, as she pulled out a set of keys. They jingled her hand as she seemed restless to leave. So, I will be back in a couple of days to take back over, but call me if you need anything. She hastily exited the front door as I turned back, walking to the room with the old man. The television was still blaring. I looked over to see his eyes were no longer drooped down, but were now fully closed. It looked like my night was going to be easier than I thought. I waited for a few moments before a dull snore came from the man. I debated whether to turn the television off, but decided to not bother before heading to my room, quietly shuffling to my room so as to not disturb him. The bed was actually more comfortable than I expected, as I began to scroll TikTok to relax. It groaned as my eyes began to open. I watched the door crack slightly. The room was now dark. I must have dozed off while on my phone. My eyes were blurry, but the sound continued as the door opened further. Hello, I asked quietly, debating whether it was an old house settling or someone like Bailey checking in on me. A light scraping noise came from somewhere I couldn't quite pinpoint. It was unsettling enough for me to reach to turn on the light. I sat up in bed to see something was out of place, but there was no one in the room with me, nor anything that could be making the scratching noise. I got out of bed and stuck my head out into the hallway. It was dark, except for the glow of the TV screen from the man earlier. I could hear a faint sound, like people talking, as if he were deep asleep with the show still on. I closed the door and settled back into bed, turning off the light and beginning to drift off again, when the door slowly opened once more. The creaking sound became louder as I heard the doorknob hit the wall. There he stood, the old man. His eyes were no longer closed or droopy, but open wide like a startled animal. He hunched over and slowly walked into the room with me, his hair still standing and his robe dragging on the floor. He looked around the room, his mouth agape, studying it from the floor to the walls and even the ceiling. I almost said something before I noticed something. He slowly crept around the room before turning his sights on me. He held something tightly gripped in his hand, which made every hair on my body stand up and tingle. I could only get a brief glimpse, but it was enough to scare the hell out of me. A knife in his hand. I don't know why I pretended to still be asleep, but he inched closer to me, his eyes and mouth still wide open, as if he were walking like a zombie in the bedroom. He stopped at the foot of the bed, watching me as I pretended to sleep. I felt I was done for, but he just let out a strange chuckle before turning around and slowly shuffling out of the room. I laid there, my mind racing, as I searched my bed for my phone, quickly grabbing it in hand while getting out of the bed. I quietly walked to the door, sticking my head out once again. This time I was greeted with creaks and croaks from wooden floors, along with the sound of television. He was walking around, but I couldn't see him. He was in one of the other rooms. Where, though? I just knew I had to get out of the house as quickly as possible. I walked as lightly as I could. The sound of him walking was intentionally heavy and menacing, wherever he was in the house. A few steps in, a loud sound came from underneath my feet. The hardwood floor had betrayed me with a light creak, but it might as well have been a scream. "You don't have to hide," a raspy, aged voice yelled as the footsteps picked up the pace, shuffling and dragging from somewhere nearby. I panicked as I pushed open another door in the hall and slipped in. "We can end this really quickly." The room was dark and musty. I could see the outline of a bed among more stacks of books. There were even books resting on the bed. It looked as if no one had used this room in years. "I'm going to find you," the voice shouted menacingly. The footsteps were coming closer. I had to hide as I looked around the room. Each piece of furniture, whether drawer, table, or even chair, had stacks of books upon it. I dashed towards the bed itself and crawled underneath, right before the door swung violently open. "Are you in here?" I held my breath, trying to hold back the urge to scream from the top of my lungs as I could hear him walk in. Each step he took, my heart felt like it would leap from my chest as he carefully walked around. "We are going to end this," the voice screeched. "I've been waiting for so long for the right moment to do this." He paused for a moment, staying stationary. I may have only been able to see his feet, but I knew he was looking. Not even a twitch came from me as I waited patiently, hoping he would give up in this room. After a few moments, he shuffled out of the room. I peeked out to see the door still open, but the old man was nowhere to be found. I was just going to have to run for it. As I slid from underneath the bed and darted towards the hallway, I looked around to hear the old man yelling somewhere in the house. "I know you are still here." I just ran towards the door, the television becoming louder as I came near the room where I had thought he had peacefully gone to sleep. As I got closer, I could see the light pour out into the hallway from the television, casting a shadow on the floor. He was in that room. I don't know why I stopped to take a glimpse, especially being so close to freedom, but I did, and saw a figure standing in the dark right in front of the television, as if he were watching his show again. "I'm leaving and calling the police," I yelled out, catching its attention. A strange hissing noise came from the direction as the figure began to contort, its head twisting around to reveal that it wasn't the old man. It was something else entirely. It started to move quickly. Each inch it got closer, sounding as if its bones were snapping. As it wobbled its way towards me, I noticed that its skin was a dark hue of green, and its mouth was covered in crooked and sharp teeth. But something was missing. It had no eyes, not even eye sockets. I started to move towards the front door again, but it moved faster than I could imagine. I felt wet limbs with a putrid smell grab onto me, tossing me down as if I were nothing more than a doll. "Get off me!" I screamed from the top of my lungs as the creature pinned me down and bit into the air with a frenzy. I kicked and squirmed, trying to free myself from it as its mouth started to move closer to my face. I closed my eyes. Then I felt something wet hit my face. "I've been waiting for you to show again." The raspy voice yelped as I opened my eyes to see a knife's blade coming from its face, oozing a dark blood as it dripped upon me. "Been a while, but I knew you would show up." The creature shook its head in a panic, releasing its grip from me as I crawled from its grasp. The old man took the knife out of the skull of whatever lay before me. He lifted the blade high above his head before striking down on the creature again, causing it to screech. He continued to do so, each sound coming from it becoming weaker and quieter, before it finally quit making a sound and lay lifeless on the hardwood floor. I wiped the dark, bloody substance from my face and looked at the man, struggling to stand and breathing heavily as I leaned against the wall. "What the hell was that?" I cried out. "That was called using bait." Hello, my sweet little sleepy beans. If you enjoy my spooky whispers, please give the like button and subscribe button a huge warm hug and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our future uploads. Alright, sleepy beans, let's get into today's story. There's a little cottage right on the water in Maryland called Cottage 506. It's a rustic place with a wood fire stove, a couple of small beds, and a small sitting area for breakfast. And then, outside the cottage on the porch, you have this amazing view of the water. And then, behind the cottage is the resort that the cottage is a part of. And the resort offers guests that stay in this cottage great food, great entertainment. I mean, this is a great spot. However, Cottage 506 has a dark secret, and it's the reason I and many other people will never be staying there. A little afternoon on Valentine's Day, 1998, a married couple named Steve and Kim Rico held hands as they walked towards their car. They had just dropped their 8-year-old daughter off at a neighbour's house in the suburban neighbourhood in Maryland where they lived, and now Steve and Kim had the whole weekend to themselves, and they were really excited about it because they had this big trip planned. Now, admittedly, Kim had no idea what they were actually going to be doing because Steve was the one who planned it, and he was obviously being very secretive about the details. He wanted this to be a surprise. And so, for weeks leading up to this weekend, Kim would see Steve on the phone all the time, presumably planning whatever it is they were going to be doing. But he wouldn't let Kim hear what he was saying on the phone. He would kind of muffle his voice, or he'd hang up before she could come over and hear him. And then, also after these secretive phone calls, Kim would often see Steve writing all these notes down in his journal, presumably about whatever it was he was planning. The only details Steve shared with Kim about this trip was make sure you wear something nice. When the couple reached their car, Steve hopped in the driver's seat and Kim hopped in the passenger seat. And immediately, right after Steve had fired up the car, Kim turned to him and said, "Are you going to tell me? You going to tell me where we're going?" But Steve just grinned and said, "Nope, it's a surprise." Kim gave a theatrical sigh and sat back and feigned frustration. But inside, the way she was really feeling was just excited. This was so cool that Steve had put so much effort into whatever it is they were going to do. But also Kim was seeing her husband was really making a big effort to make her happy. And this was kind of new because lately their relationship had been really rocky. Kim and Steve had been married for 9 years by this point, and they were both very, very different people. Steve was a total homebody, kind of introverted, and Kim was the opposite. She was super extroverted and very social. But when they first met each other, it was actually their stark differences that brought them together. For Kim, when they met, she was in her early 20s. She had just dropped out of college, and her experience with men so far had been she would meet them at parties or bars. And at first it would seem like their relationship was great, but then invariably these guys would just kind of move on and break Kim's heart. But Steve was different. He was this huge guy, 6'4", massive football player, but he was totally a gentle giant. And as soon as he met Kim, Kim could tell this guy is different. he's treating her with respect. You know, he's loyal to her, he really cares about her, and so they hit it off right away, and Kim very quickly became pregnant, at which point Steve asked her to marry him, and Kim didn't hesitate for a second. They were totally in love, and marriage to Steve had really been a stabilising factor in Kim's life. She wound up going back to college and got her degree, which landed her a job as a surgical technician, which is what she did now. And Steve turned out to be just a fantastic father, and he wound up actually staying home with their daughter when she was a baby so Kim could go out and work. And Kim always thought it was funny when she would come home and she would see Steve standing in the doorway cradling this infant. But he's like this massive person, and so their baby looked like a toy. But unfortunately, over the last year, Kim had seen a change in Steve. He went from being a shy person, but a person who could go out and function in society, to a shy person who basically stopped going outside altogether. Steve basically refused to go out anywhere with Kim. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to spend time with their friends or family. He just wanted to stay home and watch TV or hang out in the basement. It was pretty obvious he was depressed, but his introvertedness was becoming kind of stifling for Kim. And so Kim approached Steve and said, "You really need to go to therapy to get better here. You know, I'll go with you. We can do couples therapy." But Steve refused. And so finally, right around this past New Year, Kim decided she had just had enough. She was totally unhappy. She did not feel like Steve was going to change, and so Kim told Steve that she wanted to get divorced. And when Steve heard that, he realised the gravity of the situation. He knew Kim was unhappy with him, but he did not know she was thinking about separating. And so Steve kind of broke down and begged Kim to give him another chance. You know, let him prove to her that he will change, that he wants this marriage to work. And Kim said, "Okay." And so that was how Steve wound up planning this very secret getaway on Valentine's Day. This trip was supposed to be the start of their new and improved marriage, and so Kim was really excited and optimistic about the future. After driving for about an hour and a half, Steve pulled off the highway and began following signs towards the eastern shore, which is a waterfront area of Maryland. That's very beautiful, that was located about 70 miles away from Steve and Kim's home. After driving for a few minutes, Steve pulled into the parking lot of the Harbour Town Golf Resort, and as soon as he pulled into a spot and turned off the car, he clapped his hands and turned to Kim and said, "Okay, we're here." And Kim looked from her husband out to all the perfectly manicured grounds in the beautiful resort, and she smiled and leaped out of the car excitedly. Kim and Steve took each other's hands and marched inside to check in. And as they were checking in, the person behind the desk gave them glasses of champagne. And then, after handing Kim and Steve their key cards, the receptionist told them that their cottage where they were staying was like the nicest property at the resort. Kim and Steve were totally pumped. They took their champagne and their room keys. They walked back to their car and then drove a little ways deeper into the resort to their cottage. It was cottage 506, and it looked out over the water. And when they went inside, Kim was totally wowed. It was this rustic suite with a wood fire stove in the middle, and 2 queen-size beds, and a little coffee table area for breakfast over here. It was perfect. And then, when Kim actually walked into this cottage, she noticed that there was a card sitting on a table, and it looked like a wedding invitation. Kim was confused and looked over at Steve, and Steve just smiled and said, "Go check it out." And so Kim walked over, and she grabbed the note and she began reading it. And as she did, she began to smile. The card really was a wedding invitation, albeit it was for a fake wedding, because it would turn out this was not just a random overnight that Steve had planned for both of them. Instead, he had purchased a romantic getaway package, which included this amazing cottage, but also a professional dinner theatre performance that would be held on the resort grounds. Kim read the description of the dinner theatre show on this invitation. It was a murder mystery called The Bride, who cried, where the actors in the show would put on a whole fake wedding. And then, at the end of the wedding, somebody would get killed, and the audience would need to figure out who did it. For an extrovert like Kim, an activity like this was perfect. And so, Kim felt totally touched that clearly Steve had hurt her, and the first thing he did to kind of win her back was to begin to do the things that Kim really wanted to do, which was really going out and having fun. And so, after Kim finished reading the card, she turned and looked over at Steve, and Steve was kind of nervous because he wasn't sure if Kim was going to like it. And Kim, she broke into this huge smile. She walked over to Steve and gave him a big hug. And Steve, he was so happy, and he hugged her real tight right back. Kim and Steve would spend the next couple of hours sitting by their fire inside of their nice cottage, drinking their champagne and talking about the future and just telling stories and having a good time. And then, around 7 p.m, Steve and Kim put on their nicest clothes and walked their way over to the area on the resort where this dinner theatre was going to happen. It was in an event hall with a bunch of round tables set up for the audience. And so, once Steve and Kim and the other audience members all took their seats, the actors and actresses came into the room, and they were all dressed in their wedding clothes. There was a bride and a groom and a wedding party, and the audience was instructed to participate in the wedding as if they were wedding guests. And so the audience all stood up, and they began kind of having this fake social hour of meeting all the wedding guests. And then Steve, Kim, and the audience members all took their seats, and they got ready to watch the drama unfold. And Kim pretty much immediately was totally absorbed in this performance. She was so enthusiastic, talking to the actors and talking to the other guests, and really pretending like she was part of the wedding. I mean, she was having a blast. The play itself was about a groom who was in the mafia who was forcing his bride to marry him by threatening her family. The climax came when the groom stood up and gave a toast with his champagne. He took a sip and then fell down dead. Kim watched all of this with delight, but she kept looking over at Steve, hoping he too would be smiling and having a good time. But each time she looked at him, he was just kind of stone-faced and looking straight ahead like he just didn't care, or he was totally disinterested. And then, a couple of times when Kim leaned over and said, "Hey, you know, honey, who do you think did it? Who do you think the killer is?" Steve basically just completely ignored her. It was like she wasn't there, and the play wasn't there. He was just totally zoned out. Eventually, Kim and a few other very enthusiastic audience members figured out the killer in the play was the bride's mother who poisoned the groom. And then, after this discovery was made, the play was over. As everyone got up from their seats and began to leave, Kim couldn't help but feel really annoyed with Steve because he was just so silent and not invested in this play. And it's like, we came all the way here. Why aren't you at least pretending to enjoy this? But Kim also thought, you know, Steve put a ton of effort into this weekend. He's clearly trying. I'm not going to start a fight. I'm not going to bring it up. And so finally, Kim just said to Steve, "Hey, you know, why don't we go to the bar and get a couple of drinks, bring them back to our cottage, and just hang out there for the night?" And when Steve heard this, he actually smiled and said, "Okay, great, let's do it." And by the time the couple got back to the front door of cottage 506, they were holding hands again and laughing and telling stories. and they went inside, and Steve put the beers down on the table. And then Kim said she was going to go in the bedroom and just quickly change into something more comfortable. And so Kim walked into the bedroom and shut the door, and Steve walked to the front door and turned the lock. 3 hours later, a man named Philip Parker, who was staying at the resort with his family, heard a commotion in the lobby. And he heard people saying there might be a fire at cottage 506, and there could be somebody still inside. Philip immediately turned to his cousin who was with him, and the two of them bolted outside and just started running towards cottage 506. And as soon as they got to a place where they could see the cottage from a distance, they could see black oily smoke pouring out of the windows. When they got up to the burning cottage, Philip ran to the front door, but it was locked. He couldn't get inside. He screamed to see if anybody was in there, but there was no answer. And so Philip and the cousin ran around to the back of the cottage, where there was a glass sliding door. And Philip, he tried to handle, but it was locked. At this point, the cousin said he was going to run back to the resort and get a fire extinguisher. And after the cousin ran off, Philip turned back towards the sliding glass door and realised it actually opened on both ends, and he had only checked one side and found that side to be locked. But on the other side, which he was now noticing, it was obviously unlocked because it was open just barely. And so Philip immediately opened it up and all the smoke began coming out. And so Philip dropped down to get a better look, because down low the smoke had not fully settled. There was a bit of an air pocket right at the bottom of the floor. And so Philip got down and he looked inside, and for a second he couldn't quite see anything. But then he noticed in the middle of the bedroom, right inside this cottage, he could clearly see somebody's feet. Somebody was on the ground. And so Philip screamed that he was coming in, and then he opened the door the rest of the way, and he began low crawling into the bedroom, and as he did, he was hacking and coughing from all the smoke. And so finally Philip reached this person, and he grabbed their foot and he shook them to try to wake them up, but they weren't moving. But the fire was getting bigger and stronger. The smoke was getting thicker. Philip was really starting to panic and was worried that he too would get trapped in here. And so he just grabbed this person's leg and began pulling them. And was really hard, but he finally got this person back to the door. He couldn't quite get them over that lip of where the sliding door was. But right then, Philip's cousin showed up, and the two of them were able to grab this person and get them out of the cottage. And this was the moment when Philip finally got a look at the person he was just dragging out, and it was immediately clear to him that this person was deceased. Their face was basically gone. It was completely burned away. In the days, weeks leading up to this weekend, Steve really was taking secret phone calls and writing notes down in his journal, because he was planning something very special. But he was not the only one with plans for this weekend. Here's what police say happened after Kim and Steve got back to their cottage following the show, and Kim went into the bedroom to change, and Steve went to the front door and locked it. A couple of minutes later, Kim came out of the bedroom wearing something sexy, and she looked at Steve and smiled and said, "Come on, get in bed. I'll join you in a second." And so Steve's like, "Great, my plan is working. We're going to reconnect here." He climbed in bed and he laid down, and Kim, she walked over and got something out of her bag, and then she walked back over to the bed and she pulled out a syringe and she stabbed it into Steve before he could do anything, and she injected him with something called suspense. Kim had access to this drug from her job as a surgical tech. Succinylcholine is used to relax people's muscles during surgery, but if you give someone too big a dose, it can stop their breathing, and this drug works pretty much instantly, which means Steve would have seen his wife stab him with that syringe, but then instantly he would have been totally paralysed, but fully awake and fully alive. And so, as he was laying there, he would have seen his wife put the syringe down and then grabbed lighter fluid and then walked over to him and calmly poured the lighter fluid all over Steve's face and chest. And then, one of Steve's final images he likely saw before his lungs stopped working and he died was his wife striking a match and lighting him on fire. After lighting Steve on fire, Kim casually walked out the back sliding door. She shut it, leaving it open just a crack, and then she made her way to the resort lobby where she put on this big act about how her cottage was on fire and she thinks her husband was still inside. And Philip overheard Kim say that her husband was still inside. And Philip overheard Kim say that her husband might be inside the cottage, which is when he and his cousin jumped into action. They ran to the cottage and ultimately found Steve, deceased, inside of the cottage. Ultimately, Kim never intended to give Steve a second chance in their marriage. She was already having an affair with a much younger man who was in the Marines, and she was just done with Steve. And so, as Steve began telling his friends and family how he was going to make a huge effort to save his marriage, Kim was going around to her friends and literally, openly talking about how she wanted to murder her husband. But nobody took her seriously. They thought she was just kind of venting and being kind of dramatic. But as soon as the news broke that Steve had died in this fire and Kim had not, people rushed to the police to tell them, pretty sure Kim had something to do with this. Kim was convicted of her husband's murder and she was sentenced to life in prison. It would turn out the primary reason why Steve was so secretive before going on this trip was he really wanted it to be this unbelievably special, romantic, kinda like recreation of the couple's first date. And so what he was doing is he was calling all of Kim's friends and family members and asking them questions about things Kim liked because he wanted to incorporate all of her interests in this trip. And then, after these calls, when Steve was writing in his journal, that was not just writing down, like, logistics of the trip. He was also writing down how much he loved Kim and how excited he was for their future and what they would build together as a family. I mean, Steve really believed they were on a path to reconciliation, but, of course, that just was not the case. I just wanted to say thank you for the overwhelming support and love you guys have shown me, and thank you for joining me on my journey. Also, I want to thank today's video sponsor, Dubby Energy. Today's video is brought to you by Dubby Energy, the ultimate energy drink designed for gamers, creators, and anyone who needs a boost without the crash. Unlike those other energy drinks loaded with sugar and junk, Dubby is packed with clean ingredients to fuel your focus, energy, and performance all day long. Whether you're grinding through a gaming session or just need that extra push to get through your day, Dubby's got you covered. And the best part, it's jitter-free. No weird crashes, just clean, sustained energy. Check out the link in the description below and use my code WETT at checkout to save 20% off your order. Yes, that's right. Not 10, but a whopping 20% off. Power up with Dubby Energy and stay on top of your game. A huge thank you to Dubby for sponsoring this video.